In paganism, or European polytheism, we revere our ancestors. But I think regardless of whatever religion you subscribe to, or if there's any religion at all, we should revere our ancestors, regardless. And you know, that is one thing that these leftists, these people that promote, this critical race theory, they try to make us detest our ancestors if you're white. They tell us that they're colonizers, that they were cruel, that they were ruthless, just whatever. But we should know better than that, and I'm very certain that anyone watching this does know better. Oh, and something else that I forgot to say earlier that I meant to. Whenever any of these leftists or any of these faggots try to make you feel some sort of guilt about your ancestors, about how ruthless or cruel or whatever that they were, it's quite simple what you do. You simply tell them that you are fucking glad and that you are fucking grateful that they were ruthless and that they were cruel when the times called for it. I think, in a way though, sometimes I do think that we perhaps view them through a rose-colored lens, as we often view the past through a rose-colored lens. In the past, things were much more difficult. Things were a lot harder. There wasn't no convenience, and there was probably very little comfort. Life was harsh back then. But honestly, I see it as this, though. How they lived back then was much, much better than how we live today. Modernity has really done a number on us. And although life was much harsher back then, I think it was also much more rewarding and much more natural. But I think we should remember that our ancestors, they were people too. And they had faults. And sometimes they had failings. But it's important to remember that if you are alive today, that no matter their faults and no matter what failings they may have had, that in the end, they ultimately were successful. Because you are here as you are today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my grandparents. My grandparents, they were good people, but they had faults and they had failings. And I'm not making this video to speak ill of the dead in any way. I've just got a point to make. My grandparents, they had problems, as everyone does. You'll never find a person that doesn't have problems, doesn't have adversity. That's what makes life life. My grandparents, though, they had some problems. I'll start out with my maternal side. My mother's father was named Roger, and her mother was named Georgia. I've said before, none of my grandparents lived to be especially old. Most 3 out of 4 of them were dead by the time they were 60. One of my grandparents I never even knew. He died a couple of years before I was born. But my grandfather, Roger, he was a good man. He was a kind man. But he was an alcoholic. He passed away back in 2004. When I was a senior in high school, he was only 57 years old. He had problems. He was unable to quit drinking. I can remember that on my 12th, it was around my 12th birthday, we went up there to see him. I didn't get to see him very often, but we'd go up there and see him every so often. And a lot of times when I'd seen him, he had been drinking some. Not, fall over drunk or anything, but, I could smell it on him. I still loved being around him, though. I remember he took me out to the woods behind his house. He lives up at the top of a holler. And he showed me his moonshine still. And I remember being amazed by it. And whenever we walked back in, it was just me and him. Whenever we walked back to his house, Mom asked us where we had been, and he told her that he had showed me his moonshine still, I don't think she was too impressed with that, but she didn't say nothing. You see, my parents, my mother and father, in a way, they had a lot more traumatic childhood than I did. They really did. Me and my younger brother had a very good childhood. My parents never drank. We certainly weren't spoiled. My dad worked as a machinist. It's a pretty good job. My mother never had to work. And we weren't rich by any means, Me and my little brother, we grew up in a small house. We had a living room, a kitchen. Mom and Dad had their bedroom, and next to their bedroom was me and my little brother's bedroom. We shared a room the entire time I was growing up. We slept in bunk beds. We certainly weren't wealthy by any means. One good thing, though, is that we did have a decent bit of land in a beautiful place that my paternal grandfather had passed down to us. I know another story illustrating kind of how traumatic my mother and her sister Kim's childhood was. That there was one time when my mom was probably around 8 or 9 years old. Her sister would have been 7 or 8. There's a year difference between them. My grandfather, Roger, was off working. He worked as a manager at a furniture factory in Johnson City, Tennessee. He was off working that morning, and Mom and Kim were at the house with my grandmother, Georgia. And my grandmother, Georgia, was cleaning, and somehow she was cleaning or working on something, and somehow she ended up getting electrocuted. And it electrocuted her so hard that it knocked her out cold. And it scared my mother and my aunt absolutely to death. They were just little girls, They got my grandmother, one of them under each arm, and they drug her down the road to my great-grandparents' house, my grandfather's mother and father. They drug her down the road, and as they got closer to my great-grandparents' house, my great-grandfather heard them crying and screaming. He ran out there, and he picked up my grandmother and carried her into their house. I don't know if they ended up calling the ambulance or what, but it turns out my grandmother, she came to. She is okay. The only thing wrong with her was the fact that her heels were skinned up terribly from being drug probably about 1/8 of a mile down the road. So yeah, that was, I'd probably my mom has told me that story so many times. And I have heard my father say before that if it wasn't for my great-grandparents down there, there's a chance that my mother and aunt may not have lived to adulthood. Because I'm not saying this to speak ill about my grandparents. It's just how it was. On my father's side, my grandfather was named Ford. My grandmother was named Jean. My father, he also had a bit of a traumatic childhood. My grandfather Ford, he was a very intelligent man, very smart man. From everything that I've heard back home from older people about him. See, he died a couple of years before I was born. And it's something funny is my dad actually told me once that my grandfather actually predicted my told my father that when he was on his deathbed that he would have a son here soon. And 2 years later, 25 months later, almost to the day, I was born. But see, he served in 3 branches of the military. He was born in 1926. He served in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. He did 4 years in each. He served in Korea as a medic. He was a very intelligent man, and I've also heard other people, older people back home that knew him. They told me that he was involved in intelligence of some form as well. Now, my father was born in 1959, and my grandparents were only married for about a year or so after my father's birth. He was born at the Naval Hospital up in Hampton, Virginia. My grandfather, he was cold and distant to my grandmother. I've heard it said too, when he came back from Korea in the earlier mid-50s, that he wasn't quite the same. I'd say he's seen a lot of horrible things. But he was also a very handsome man, my grandfather. He was a real Chad, you could say. And he was a philanderer, a real womanizer. My dad's told me before that when he was younger that my grandfather would get letters from women all across the country. He traveled a lot too. All across the country. My father's also told me that he had visited all 48 states here in the, the contiguous United States. He was always traveling. But he divorced my grandmother. They divorced, actually, I think she divorced him when my father was only a year old. I mean, it's not a good thing, to be running around on your wife. And my grandmother raised my father. My grandfather was, of course, still involved in my dad's life. I think my dad, most summers, would go back home, up there to where my grandfather lived, and see him and stuff. But it was my grandmother and her husband that she married later that raised my father. And unfortunately, the man that she married tended to drink. And I mean, I'm not saying this to speak ill, because he did do good things. He provided for my father and my grandmother. And my dad, he also has a younger half-brother and half-sister due to this. But my grandfather Ford, he also had a bit of a crazy streak, as I mentioned earlier, when they said when he came back from Korea, he was different. One time, I think it was in the early 70s, and I've heard this story from 2 different people back home, 2 different older people. A man that was working for my grandfather the day that it happened. And I've also heard the story too. That's where I first heard this story, is actually from the man that he shot. Strangely. But anyway, my grandfather and his young friend, we'll just call him Mr. Buck, they were working on fencing up there. Grandfather, he had quite a bit of land, and that's where my father got his land from that I was raised on. They were out working. They'd went to the little hardware store there in town and were buying fencing to repair fences with. And they see this other young man. And the young man who had actually first told me this story. This young man, he had kind of a reputation around home back then as to being a thief. Well, he walks up to my grandfather and Mr. Buck, and he says, all friendly like, just making conversation, like, what are y'all doing today? What's your plans? My grandfather says, we're just repairing some fencing, and this evening I'm going to leave out and go to California. As I said, my grandfather traveled a lot. Well, the man bids them farewell and walks away, and Mr. Buck looks at my grandfather and says, "Ford, you aren't going to California tonight. Why'd you lie to him?" And my grandfather Ford said that he was going to teach him a lesson. Well, they repair the fencing, Mr. Buck goes home. And that evening, after dark, my grandfather sat in his living room in a rocking chair, in a recliner, I guess. And sure enough, eventually, that young man from earlier came sneaking up onto his porch, pries the door open, and comes in. And my grandfather is sitting there with a revolver, and it would be interesting. He ends up shooting the young man, shoots him once in the arm and once in the hand. Now that he got out of there very quickly. Kind of a harsh lesson to teach a young man, but that young man, who many few decades later told me this story, said that was a lesson he never forgot. You know, as I said, my grandfather had kind of a crazy streak. It's a little bit harsh, but I guess he could have shot to kill very easily. But what the point and as far as my grandmothers go, they had some problems as well. Both of them had a very bad temper sometimes. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we should try to remember that our ancestors were people, and that they had problems, and that sometimes they had faults, and that they had failings. Some ancestors, perhaps more so than others. But does this make me think differently of my grandparents? Does it make me love them less? No, not in the least. Not one bit. In fact, it makes me love them even more. It truly does. Because without their faults and their failings, my parents there's a chance my parents wouldn't have been good parents, you know. I remember one time back years ago when I was into drugs and everything, in one of the talks that my dad was having with me, I remember him saying, he was kind of wondering how I had ended up the way that I was. Because, you know, as I said earlier, my parents never were into anything like that, not in the least. And here I am into pills and methamphetamine and in and out of jail. My dad says something, he said, you know, when me and your mom was growing up, we both seen what this sort of thing does. We both seen how destructive addiction really is. And we didn't want that, you know. My dad said that he never wanted that. He always wanted to have a family. And my mom, she went through a lot of the same troubles with her parents. And they never wanted that. So I am grateful to my grandparents. Because without their faults, there's a chance my parents wouldn't have turned out the way they did. And you know, in a way, it's sad to say, I had to learn myself. I had to learn myself going through all the shit that I did, the self-inflicted messes that I got myself in. I had to learn for myself. And I don't want that sort of thing anymore. I certainly don't want to have it for when I have children. So I don't mean to speak ill of my ancestors. They had their problems, and they had their faults. But ultimately, they were successful. You can't deny that. Can't deny that one bit. My grandfather, Ford, left a good amount of land and a couple of houses for my father. my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side, they succeeded as well. So you can't, I'm not saying they were successful. But anyways, and I think it's important that we remember this, that we still revere our ancestors, but we also should keep in mind, bear in mind, that they were people too. And that we should remember the good things that they did, and honor them. But even when they did make mistakes, and even with their flaws in character, that we can learn from them. We can learn from them and apply it to our own lives. I've rambled on long enough. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.